Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Accidental Czar, The Life and Lies of Vladimir Putin, with Andrew Weiss, who is a James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Today's program will be moderated by Jim Thomson, professor at the Pardee Rand Graduate School and President Emeritus of the Rand Corporation. For those of you who would like to submit questions to Jim and Andrew, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screens where you can type in your questions. Rachel Kenderdine, our community manager, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which should start in about 35 or 40 minutes. And with that, Jim and Andrew, I'd love to have you join us, and we can't wait to get going on this very exciting discussion. Thank you both.
Oh, I keep mismanaging the buttons here. Okay. Well, I want to welcome Andrew Weiss to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, even if virtually. What's not mentioned by Kim in Andrew's biography is Andrew is from Beverly Hills, and he went to Beverly Hills High School. So we're welcome back to Los Angeles. It's great to have you here. You heard, Andrew's at the Carnegie Endowment. He and I shared some background. We were together at Rand when I was president, and he managed our Russian American Business Leaders Forum, among other things he was doing then. And we got to know several of the oligarchs, a couple of whom are mentioned in the graphic novel that we're going to talk about today. So, Andrew, I think the first question I have, though, is I'd like to, how did you get into the business of being a Russian specialist? What did you how did you get from Beverly Hills High School to your career as a Russian specialist?
Well, first of all, it's great to see you, Jim, and I'm grateful to Kim and you for hosting me today. It's nice to be in LA virtually. And I grew up in Beverly Hills, and my parents had both been civil servants at some point in their careers. They actually met in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And like a lot of people in the mid-1980s, the big story of that period was Gorbachev's reforms and opening up the Soviet system, perestroika, glasnost, all that stuff. And believe it or not, I actually had dinner at Mr. Chow on Camden Drive in Beverly Hills in about 1984 or 1985 with one of my brother's college roommates who had just returned from studying in the Soviet Union. And to somebody like me who didn't really fit in Beverly Hills and wanted to get as far away from Beverly Hills as possible, moving to the Soviet Union, being an exchange student seemed like the most interesting and, somewhat iconoclastic thing I could do.
And how did you get from there to to going to college, and then from college to the NSC staff when you were 20 whatever years old?
Yeah, so I had a really charmed set of experiences. I studied at undergrad and in grad school at Columbia in New York City. At some point, I met someone in the intelligence world who said, "Oh, Columbia, Yalta on the Hudson." So I was a little more of a hardcore anti-communist myself. But anyways, leaving that aside, I got to the Pentagon in the summer of 1991. Just as the Soviet Union was becoming unglued, and started working in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in 1992. I then moved over to the State Department in 1994, and by 1998, I was working at the White House. So I had a really great ringside seat for a lot of the immediate collapse of the Soviet Union and the new sets of relationships that were being stood up at that time.
And you also, of course, we had a view of the emergence of Vladimir Putin in the late 1990s and 2001. So, and that, of course, Vladimir Putin is our subject today, at least at the beginning, and it's in the graphic novel, which I'll wave here. I've got a copy of it, proving to Andrew that I actually bought it. So, so, anyways, Accidental Czar. So, how did you come to decide to write? I mean, it's a really interesting book, and I recommend it to everybody on this call. But how did you come to decide to write a graphic novel, and how did you find your partner to do it?
Yeah, so for those of the folks on the call who haven't read graphic novels, they're a really interesting format that can be a blend of serious, cerebral adult material with a very engaging graphic style. And there's some really good books. There's one about the Holocaust that many people may have read called Mouse by Art Spiegelman. There's another one about the Iranian Revolution called Persepolis by Marjan Satrapi. So these books, when they work, are really magical. In my day job at a think tank, I realize how privileged I am that I get to do research in Russia and Ukraine in the broader region. But a lot of the work I do is really aimed at a very narrow audience of policy people, elected officials, and my fellow experts. And what was noticeable to me was that conversation tends, because it's sort of an insider conversation, it can be kind of insular. And I've always been looking throughout my time in the think tank world for a medium that would allow me to reach a broader, wider audience, both age and background. And graphic novels are perfect for that. And what's amazing about this book is I've had career CIA people tell me they enjoyed it. I've had people in my son's third grade classroom tell me they enjoy it. So it really captures this huge swath of humanity. And I didn't need to change the message. I didn't have to tailor it to those groups individually. I just called it like I saw it. And the secret sauce to this, of course, is presenting the information graphically. And my publisher, First Second, paired me up with a very successful graphic novel writer named Box Brown, who's written several successful graphic novels over the past decade or so, but they tended to cover non-foreign policy topics like the actor Andre the Giant, the video game Tetris, things like that. So for him, this was the first time he'd illustrated somebody else's book. And it was a really fun chance to collaborate with a really sophisticated graphic novel artist himself.
Great. Well, let's show a couple of images I wanted to, which will allow us to talk about some of the themes of the book. I thought I'd start with Katie, if you could try to put up page 63 from the book. Let's see if we can have a look at that. And this, of course, this page gets us to the title of the book. It's The Accidental Czar, and here we see the commentary here that in a sense Yeltsin has basically picked somebody who is in Russian called a nobody to succeed him, and he had somebody who had basically been doing things like managing the property office of the Kremlin less than 2 years earlier, and now suddenly is propelled into this position of first prime minister and then president. I guess we can put that down, but I want to ask you, Andrew, that could you just say a few words? How did that happen? That he went so quickly into that, from nowhere to somewhere, I guess you can say.
Yeah. A big part of the book is trying to peel back this mystique that has been deliberately foisted on all of us, that Vladimir Putin was the super spy, the creme de la creme of the KGB, and then as a result of all his great accomplishments in the intelligence world, was catapulted to being head of state. And that's just not the case. He had a really mediocre career in the Soviet intelligence apparatus and washed out basically around the time he became a lieutenant colonel. So this was not someone who was a high flyer. And then he bounced around in a second tier city, which was Leningrad, and worked in the mayor's office and was a fixer for the reformist mayor at the time. But because of the circumstances in St. Petersburg, it was not the main city. It was a second tier place. A lot of the grubby corruption that was the way to make a quick buck, he was a sort of gatekeeper for various sweetheart deals with, shady characters. And then when he came to Moscow in the late 1990s, the country was increasingly coming unglued because the Yeltsin presidency had been a series of crises, had been, crisis after crisis, and then Yeltsin's own health started to deteriorate, and the government was mainly in the hands of his entourage, starting first and foremost with his daughter, Tatiana. And that group, which was known at the time as the family, had, of course, put their fingers in all sorts of lucrative, shady deals. And there was a lot of scrutiny that was brewing as part of the broader political struggle in Moscow. And at one point, the prosecutor general, the Russian equivalent of the attorney general, had started to make accusations about Yeltsin's family and accusing them of being involved in various corruption kickback schemes. And the way the Yeltsin family tried to push back against those accusations was something that I think a lot of people now know as compromise, but they had released a videotape of someone who looked like the prosecutor in bed with two naked young women. And Putin, who was then in this bizarre world, had been elevated to be the head of the security service, the FSB, was asked by reporters, does that look like the prosecutor to you? Do you have any comments on this? And Putin had vouched for the authenticity of the tape. So that had basically created a good vibe between him and the Yeltsin family. And the Yeltsin family was looking for someone to take over who would not be a threat, who would be pliable, who would be heavily dependent on them, and who would keep them in their leadership roles behind the scenes. And they cut a deal with Putin, and Putin was prepared to accept those terms. And for the first, I think, 4 years of his term in office, he kept pretty much the exact same cast of characters around, including his chief of staff.
Wow. I didn't even, it's in the book, but it's an amazing story. Katie, let's go to the next one that I wanted to show from the book, because I think it gets us towards some of the topics I want to cover today, and that is the way in which Putin has created, or basically not just Putin, in Russia, the typical way of governing is not a rule of law, but of people, men, as they used to say, and there's a hierarchy of people who, some of whom are close to Putin, but everybody is like, there's also kinds of contracts, so to speak, to put it out in quotes, contracts between and among people to keep them all together, so that it's very difficult for anybody to penetrate this hierarchy. But now we're at a period of time, we're now in the war in Ukraine, and this must be coming under some strain. And I wanted to get your comments on that, Andrew, because let's just take a few people. Where do they fit in this kind of hierarchy, or these informal contracts between people and among people? For example, there's this guy who's the head of the Wagner group. I'm pronouncing it like it's German. Wagner group, Prigozhin. What's he up to, and where does he fit into this kind of situation?
Sure. Well, let's zoom back a couple hundred years and think about the way the Russian state was formed. As you say, it wasn't formed on the basis of the rule of law. And so some very basic things never really took root in Russia. So about 500 years before, in the UK, they codified nobles' rights to own property. That didn't happen in Russia for another, as I said, 500 years or so. So you ended up with a world where property was something that the Tsar doled out in exchange for loyalty, and then he retained the ability to take it away from you if he didn't like you, or just to kind of keep things interesting, to rotate people around. So it wasn't till the latter Tsarist era that nobles owned property outright. And it made everyone very sort of wary of getting crosswise with the Tsar, because they felt, basically that their status was tentative. That sort of system has stayed pretty much intact throughout the communist era and now into the post-Soviet period. And it makes the czar, in this case, Putin, an important arbiter who just can dole out patronage and authorities at his whim. And so there's a huge competition now, to come to the Ukraine piece of this, for winning the czar's favor and getting, certain privileges or lucrative streams of income. And this person that you mentioned earlier, the very sort of made-for-TV villain, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of a private mercenary outfit, he's an outsider. He's not one of these people who served with Putin in the KGB in the 1980s or 1990s. He's from St. Petersburg, but he's basically been a hanger-on who was trying throughout the past 15 years or so to do things that would ingratiate him with more serious people in the inner circle and the inner sanctum around Putin. And it's by building these capabilities, most recently the mercenary outfit, but I think more importantly for Americans, he was one of the people responsible for interference in our election in 2016. He's trying to unlock status for himself in the Byzantine court politics of the Kremlin. The problem with a system like this is it thrives on secrecy. It thrives on lack of transparency about who knows whom and who's beholden to whom. But when you need it to do something like fight a modern conventional war against a major adversary like Ukraine, it just doesn't work very well. And so what Putin has done is he's continued to pit different groups against each other. And Prigozhin isn't necessarily a threat to Putin so much as he's a cat's paw that is going after parts of the Russian national security apparatus, specifically the military and the intelligence services, that have performed poorly. So Putin has unleashed Prigozhin to make those people's lives miserable in the hope that they'll mend their ways. It's incredibly dysfunctional, and it really, captures the rot inside the Russian leadership today.
Yeah, but he seems to be styling himself as though he's a possible coup plotter. Am I misreading that?
Yeah, I think you are. I don't see him as someone who's a pretender to the throne. I see him as someone who's constantly trying to get the leadership's attention to say, hey, give me more stuff, give me more money, give me more power, and I'll sort out this Ukraine mess for you much better than the other guys in the military or the intelligence services have been able to do up to this point. It's a too good to be true offer, but it's classic for Russia to try to build off the books capabilities in the hope that there'll be somebody who's smart enough to figure a way out of the mess they put themselves in. But the mess is so big, and the scale of what Russia has done in Ukraine is so criminal that it's really hard to imagine that one guy, who's not a military commander by background, who, comes to this through a kind of shady underworld association with, a lot of bad guys in Leningrad and now Petersburg, is going to somehow fix a full-scale war against Ukraine. It's just not serious.
That's really interesting. Okay, so that's so here during this war we have this pyramid that we just were looking at, and is it your view that nothing is yet going to shake that pyramid to cause it to start to unravel?
So the great part about being the czar is never having to apologize. So Putin has messed this thing up in the most spectacular way. He was secretive and conceiving the war during his work from home period in 2021 and 2020. He then foisted this war on everybody, came out of nowhere essentially with a game plan for going to war. He wrong-footed his military, which wasn't well prepared. He then bet everything on a swift overnight victory that didn't materialize and didn't have a good plan B in hand. And in the meantime, anything that we have been convincing ourselves of has turned out to not be quite true. So just to review a couple of those myths, the oligarchs who have a kind of glamorous image and people have made movies about them or like to write salacious articles about, they're employees of the regime. They're not people who can march into Putin's office and say, Mr. Putin, knock it off. You've just destroyed, enormous amounts of wealth and prestige. This has to stop. Your insanity is really ruining what had been a good party for all of us for the last 30 years. Putin has shown he doesn't care. He's destroyed Russia's role in the global economy. He's destroyed his own reputation. He's now an indicted war criminal, thanks to the kidnapping of innocent Ukrainian children who were taken back to Russia and away from their families. There's no limit, it seems, that is sort of standing out there where Putin would say, I can't do this, like I'm going to give up all the gains of 30 years of trying to normalize Russia's relationship with Europe and the United States. That went out the window. He's destroyed what was the most lucrative part of the Russian economy, which was its energy industry. He's now still able to sell oil and gas up to a point on world markets, but nowhere near for as lucrative a price as it was previously. And then lastly, he has now created the thing that he says he was most afraid of, which is Ukraine right next door that's going to be armed to the teeth and animated by a desire for revenge and vendetta against the Russians who came in and butchered people in their living rooms. So it's, he's now built by far, a worse, more malign environment for himself. And he did it all on his lonesome. None of this was forced on him. This was all his own miscalculation now that is, visible to all of us.
So that's where you just answered one of the questions on my list that I was going to come to later, because I was going to ask you about the elites, which of course includes these oligarchs. And I just read an article, I think over the weekend, in a journal that came in the mail from somebody, I forget by whom, but he made the argument that Putin had made a bargain with the elite of Russia. The bargain was they stay out of politics, and he doesn't interfere with their lives, and that he's now broken that bargain because their lives included, homes in Italy, flying to having their children go to universities and other places, and basically freedom on the world stage. And now they're completely. So of course I was going to ask you, I think you just answered the question. Well, so what? He broke the bargain, but I think your answer is basically the so what? It doesn't make any difference.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But just to amplify this a little more, there have been no defections in a year and a half of this madness. There are no serious major players in the Russian political or economic elite who've stood up and said, I can't be part of this. I denounce Mr. Putin. I denounce his criminal actions in Ukraine. That's a reflection both of the fact that they're essentially slaves to the regime and their status depends on staying in good odor, as well as the fear that he has sowed among the Russian elite. And that's part of why you see people falling out of windows and things like that, who are, lesser figures, but it's, serves its purpose to remind people that you can't betray the Putin regime and get away with it. That, we will track you down. We'll track you down in Spain or wherever you decide to go. So it's created a sense of, we need to stick together. And in classic form, the Russian elite, which is, perfected the art of being whiny in private and then demonstrating learned helplessness everywhere else. They like to complain about their lot in life, but if you ask them, well, what are you going to do about it? They're essentially waiting for someone else to solve their Putin problem. And I worry, just as a policy person, that we fall into that trap ourselves oftentimes. And we sort of act as if someone's going to fix Putin for us. It'll be one of his courtiers. It'll be one of his bodyguards. It'll be the unhappy, Russian public who will all sort of somehow magically rise up and get rid of this person. The reality is his hold on power remains quite strong. And we're going to be dealing with him for a while now, for a while to come. And so we need a policy that's geared to the long term as opposed to some sort of fantastical event like an asteroid hitting his motorcade. Like that's not how we're going to get rid of Vladimir Putin.
Very good. Katie, if we can go to the last image I wanted to show, because we'll have to get into another policy area. Let's just go up with this last one. This is an interesting piece. This actually involves Andrew, who's the guy sitting with the glasses on here, in a call between President Clinton and Putin, who's recently become the president. And in the process of the call, the president is trying to tell Putin to knock off his pressure tactics, and Putin flies off the handle, and that's And the last image on the bottom right is showing you that this is actually in a pattern that goes all the way back to his youth, where he would frequently fly off the handle and get into fights, and even endangered his, and getting in one fight early in his career in the KGB endangered his career just by flying off the handle. So what I wanted to ask you, Andrew, about this one is that do you think I mean, it looks like it's an embedded personality trait that we have to take seriously, that this guy could fly off the handle?
Yeah, I think there's some implications of that you want to be careful about. The Russians love to use the threat, for example, of possible use of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war as a way to intimidate the United States and the other Western partners of Ukraine, in the hope that we'll somehow magically be able to call the Ukrainians off their counteroffensive or whatever it is they're doing that gets under the Russian skin. And so that's deliberate on their part. In the particular case of Putin, in the course of his career, there's this impulsive and very emotional streak. And it's a person that when I worked at the White House, I saw up close, who oftentimes just couldn't keep his temper under control. And we were able to use that to our advantage when we were dealing with him, to kind of make him lose his cool and then sort of force him off his game. He's used that himself as a way of intimidating Western leaders. And he has this kind of, ability to seem menacing and threatening. I don't want to take anything away from him. He's very street smart. He's very cunning. Ultimately, though, he's very tactical, and he's someone who looks for short-term advantage and looks to kind of win the day. But in the case of what's going on in Ukraine right now, we've seen the limitations of someone who behaves that way. We've seen someone who lost in Ukraine. Now, this is the third big time he's lost. In 2004, there was a popular uprising called the Orange Revolution, which Russia interfered in a close presidential election and brought people out on the streets and lost big. Then again in 2014 with the Revolution of Dignity, where Russian interference in how the country was being run and trying to pull Ukraine away from Europe led to a street revolution. And now again with this disastrous war. So we need to be mindful that the image Putin has presented to the world, that he's like a Russian version of Henry Kissinger and that he's some deep strategic thinker, is artificial, just as the image of him as super spy is artificial, and that a lot of this is very self-serving.
That allows me to transfer from the hothead, but it's a related question, a policy question. Is another article I read over the weekend, which you probably saw, it was Corey Shockey, who wrote a piece in the Atlantic. Basically, I mean, it's not a lot of people have been saying what Corey has said, but basically saying, well, we're allowing ourselves to be self-deterred in Ukraine. It's sort of like incrementalism. Everything that Ukraine wants to help them fight the war, we say first no, and then at some point later we say yes. And the argument is that if the self-deterrence is that there really isn't anything for us to worry about, because Putin and Russia are deterred from doing anything serious with nuclear weapons against Ukraine. They're deterred by the consequences of nuclear use would be for them in the global stage and the global scene. The consequences for them, and they're also deterred by the things that we could do to Russia in the event of nuclear use. So stop worrying about it. Get along with the F-16s, the ATACMS that'll allow them to have missile strikes deep into Russian territory if they want to, but would also be for use on, and all the other things that the Ukrainians say they would like to have, which we're continuing not to give them. So I was sort of interested, what's your view of this notion that we're self-deterred?
So let's back up and say that the Biden administration probably never anticipated it would find itself in the world that they're in. There was a wide expectation that Ukraine would be conquered really in short order by the Russians. And that turned out to be a faulty assumption that a lot of us, myself included, all had bought into. So we've been dealing since March, April of 2022 with a series of very unforeseen circumstances that are highly volatile. And the administration has tried, I think to its credit, to be very careful in salami slicing the Russians and wheeling out certain forms of military assistance to the Ukrainians in increments, as opposed to doing it all up front. There's at the beginning, there were issues about absorption capacity. There were questions about how well and what did Ukraine really need in the heat of the moment. They needed different types of systems at the very beginning of the war compared to the systems we're talking about today. And then longer term, Ukraine's going to still live next door to Russia, and it's going to need a very capable military deterrent to prevent the Russians from thinking they can do this in the future after they've had a chance to rest and reconstitute their military. I don't think the Biden administration has self-deterred. I think what they've done is and this is the phrase that came from someone working in the administration over the summer, they've boiled the frog. And they've, provided ever increasing levels of sophisticated military equipment to the Ukrainians that the Ukrainians needed based on the battlefield conditions that proved really decisive. And we should probably dispatch with any magical thinking right now that one system, whether it's tanks or F-16s or ATACMS, which are these long-range precision strike surface-to-surface missiles, are going to fix the problem. And we have a long-term stake in providing the kind of military assistance Ukraine's going to need to be secure. The danger we face, and I think this is something the administration has to be worried about right now, is that there just isn't a ton of stuff left in the cupboard that we haven't given them already that we can give in the future without jeopardizing our own security requirements for other theaters, like, for example, in East Asia, where the U.S. has, a whole set of real, needs to deter China and to think about various contingencies. So what we're looking at with the Ukrainians right now is we've surged a lot of military assistance to them ahead of their counteroffensive, which is expected to begin any day now. But the goal is for them to make as big a set of gains as possible right now, because we probably can't sustain the level of military assistance that we've been doing for the past 15, 16 months, where we are going to need to reconstitute our own defense industrial capacity, which is something you studied at RAND and are quite familiar with, that has been basically put on ice since the end of the Cold War. So no one was expecting that we were going to be fighting a war that looks a lot like World War I in the middle of Europe, with these enormous rates of utilization of artillery and other systems that we sort of thought were outmoded compared to the way we fight wars in the here and now.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think that's a very good analysis of the situation. And I also, on the self-deterrence, I also think that, we can't just set aside the fact that the Russians have nuclear weapons. I mean, they have them. They have a doctrine for using them. They practice that. And it's not something we can just ignore. So I think it's not, I think the boiling the frog analogy is probably a good one. One last question before we come to the audience's own questions. We're about, as you mentioned, the counteroffensive. We've been all waiting for it now for a couple of months, but one of the things that occurred, I think it's possible, you may disagree with this, but having watched the Russian performance over the last year, and I think increasingly problems with shortages of people and equipment and so forth, I think it's possible, I don't think it's likely, but I also don't think it's really unlikely that the counteroffensive could turn into a rout, that the Russian army effectively just starts to run. And if that happens, what's the effect of that on Putin? I think I know your answer, but I'm curious if you think, first, what do you think about that possibility? And secondly, what would be the effect on Putin?
Yeah. So from your lips to God's ears, Jim, it would be fabulous if there's a route. I'm not a military analyst, but my sense from people who are is that going on the offense is a lot harder than being on the defense. Russians have been digging in, building fortifications and other defensive lines for the past several months. And then, lest we forget, they've been occupying a significant portion of Ukraine's territory since 2014, 2015. So they've had a lot of time to dig in. I don't think they are well led. I don't think they're particularly well equipped, and I don't think their force has high quality. So they're facing, when pressed, as you say, the Russian military starts to show the impact of having a force that's largely unhappy with their supplies and unhappy with their commanders. And they don't have anywhere near the elan or the morale that the Ukrainian side has, which clearly feels that they're fighting for their very existence. The problem is that for Ukraine to succeed in the counteroffensive, they're going to need to be able to operate in a very sophisticated way and move units around the battlefield, having them communicate with each other and reinforce each other and be very nimble and very good at, not, how do I say this, using up all of the precious equipment that the Western governments have supplied them with, like to be judicious in the way they fight the war. All of that is extremely taxing. And even in Western Europe, it would be hard for various militaries to pull something like that off. In the Ukrainian case, a lot of their best soldiers have been killed or taken off the battlefield in the first 15 or 16 months, and they've had to start reconstituting and building new units that just don't have the same amount of training or time on the battlefield that the people they're replacing had, because those were veterans of the first phase of the war in 2014, 2015. So it's a long way of saying it would be great if all the Western assistance, military assistance, intelligence support, other forms of cooperation that they're getting from the United States and the other big European powers will create some of these huge openings, and it turns into a rout. The danger, just to come back to where you started, is if something looks so grave that it potentially threatens the survival of the Putin regime, that's when you have to take seriously the prospect of some form of nuclear use, where Putin just wants to shock everyone and do something so dramatic that it makes the Ukrainians stop in their tracks. And whether we get to that point, I don't know. What would be the trigger for that? I don't know. There's been a lot of speculation about that, but I don't think it's something that I'm going to lose a lot of sleep over tonight. I think we're not really at that point.
Yeah, that's really, thanks for that answer. That's good. I guess, Rachel, we should probably now go to questions from our viewers. So I'm going to turn it over to you to take it from here.
Yes, thank you so much to both of you for being here today, and as always to our audience for submitting such great questions. I wanted to start with this one. Andrew, can you explain how Putin's security apparatus works? How does he screen his advisors, and who can he trust?
No, it's a great question. So over time, when Putin started in office 20 years ago, there were a lot of his buddies who came along with him, who had been in various jobs in places like East Germany and the KGB, and those people all did quite well in the Putin era. But over time, a lot of those people have sort of aged out, and Putin is now about 71, so he's aging himself. But older colleagues have now receded in terms of their standing around him. And what we've ended up with in a much more sort of uneven decision-making apparatus is a place where what Putin says goes. And it's not like the Politburo was in the 1970s, where you needed some level of consensus to make big decisions. In this case, Putin can move the decision-making apparatus at his whim. And he's ended up with a lot of junior people whose entire role is to follow orders and make stuff happen. Those people are not going to get ahead in their careers by challenging the boss. So Putin has sort of limited the circle of advisors around himself, but he's also a notoriously suspicious person. And so when someone comes into his office and says, hey, boss, we're worried about something the Americans are up to, or we're worried about our stock market or something else that, is trying to force him on a new path, he's inclined often to think suspiciously, like, why is this person pushing me to do something? What lies behind it? What's their hidden agenda? Are they doing someone else's bidding? And it just makes the situation more dysfunctional than it already is. And then on the security apparatus, I mean, Putin has built a massive Praetorian Guard whose main role is to ensure his political security and to protect the law and order in the main capital and major cities, so Moscow and the major cities of European Russia. And they're good at doing that. I think, we've seen very little on the streets of Moscow or Petersburg that would suggest the government is worried about things potentially getting out of hand. They've had, small demonstrations over the past year and a half, and they've done a really good job of intimidating people to stay off the streets.
We've had a number of questions come in about the war, so I want to focus on that for a few. The invasion in Ukraine seems like an unwinnable campaign. What is Putin's endgame/goal? Is this just a deadly distraction and a fear-mongering unity ploy to corral Russian elite?
So Putin has made a horrible blunder here. It's the biggest foreign policy blunder, I would say, of my lifetime. It's similar to President George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq. It's something that's just going to have cascading negative consequences for Russia for decades and generations to come. Putin's hope is twofold. The first one is that someone else is going to become the US president in 2024, and he'll be back to dealing with the likes of Donald Trump or someone like Donald Trump in early 2025. So what he really needs to do is hold out until January of 2025, and something will happen that will make the US lose its nerve. The other thing he's hoping for is it's a war of attrition, that at some point, the fact that Russia is much bigger than Ukraine will make it more painful for the Ukrainians to sustain the fight, and that it'll be really painful for their Western partners to keep them supplied with everything they need. That's not a crazy bet on his part. The United States in the past 15, 16 months has provided something like $31 billion in military aid. We are providing direct fiscal support to keep the Ukrainian budget afloat. Those are big numbers. And I can imagine how, the American people who are sort of tired of foreign entanglements and, really eager to focus on cleaning up the mess at home, might opt for a less costly support, a level of support for Ukraine. I think that would be a big mistake. I think it would be penny wise and pound foolish, but I can see how certain politicians, particularly more nativist politicians like Donald Trump, are going to be making that case throughout the 2024 campaign.
So this audience member asked, how does Russian society react to the war and Putin? Does any substantial percentage of Russian society have information about the rest of the world?
So that's what's interesting is after 2014, 2015, when the Russian government seized Crimea and began the undeclared war against Ukraine, you saw Russian politics remade overnight. And anyone who opposed or criticized those moves was immediately marginalized. So it was a beautiful political maneuver in terms of making Putin feel like he had almost universal acclaim. His approval rating was above 90%. So the percentage of the Russian public that disagreed was fewer than, it was in the single digits. It was around 8%. Nowadays, it's a very different story. You see a much more polarized society. Let's get one thing out of the way, which is Russian average people do not have a vote in how their country is ruled. There's no election coming up. There's no mechanism for them to channel their disaffection toward the regime up from their kitchens into the cabinets of power. So the government really ignores bottom-up signals. But the country itself now is much more polarized. So on the wings, you've got 20% really strong support for the war, very hawkish support. You have about 20% diehard opposition, people who think this war is horrible and a stain on Russia's reputation. And then in the middle, you've got another 60% that goes with the flow. And the regime is betting on the passivity and risk aversion of that 60% in the middle to keep this thing going indefinitely. So I think we should not be banking on the Russian people, again, solving our Putin problem for us by taking to the streets. That's just not going to happen.
So another question here about Putin. Is there any truth to Putin's failing health? If he were to die in the near future, how would this impact the war?
Yeah, so my former boss is now the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Ambassador William Burns. And when he was asked this question about, I don't know, 5 or 6 months ago, I think he said it best. He said, Vladimir Putin is entirely too healthy. I've seen nothing that contradicts what Ambassador Burns said. I believe that there's a head game that's been going on between the Russians and the Ukrainians, where people are constantly looking to demotivate each other and to cause division. So the Ukrainian side, I'm sure, really wants everyone to believe on the Russian side that Vladimir Putin is 2 steps from death, and that, you know, they need to surrender now, or, you know, they'll be left without their trusted leader. And I have no doubt that the Russian side is also spreading all sorts of lies and propaganda. The other part of the question, which is what would happen if Putin got hit by a bus tomorrow, it would be a period of a sort of caretaker leadership, and then about 60 days for new elections to be held. The unknowable question right now is whether these different groups that Putin oversees could agree on anything and would find a way to sort of hang together and install someone who can make all of them basically live with new leader's authority. That's going to be tricky, because most of the groups around Putin hate each other's guts, and sort of agreeing on anything would be quite difficult. But the fear, of course, would be that if Russia enters another period of turmoil, it will be weaker and more susceptible to Western pressure, which no one, I think, would be eager to see, particularly given the existence of these war crimes investigations and the indictments of at least 2 senior officials, Putin and another figure close to him.
So switching to a few questions about kind of the bigger picture with the war, what will be the consequences from the recent drone attacks on Russian civilians?
Right now, I think all of these things that are happening are about preparing for the counteroffensive and making the Russian side very uneasy, and making them, sort of forcing them to make decisions about how to allocate scarce resources. So until yesterday, people were not thinking we need to really beef up our air defenses in and around the Moscow suburbs. Now, suddenly, some of those areas seem more susceptible to attack. But in the end, I think it goes back to what I was saying a minute ago about the head game. The Ukrainians are trying to rattle people in the Kremlin. You saw a raid into Russian territory last week, into Belgorod Oblast, by a group of extreme Russian nationalists who have been fighting on the Ukrainian side. Today, there were drone attacks against Russian oil refineries on the Black Sea. There's just a lot of stuff happening as we get closer to the full-scale launch of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I don't think any of these attacks in and of themselves are going to set the light bulb off in the minds of the Russian leadership that we've taken the wrong path. I think they have made a bet that they're going to outlast the West, they're going to outlast Ukraine, and that nothing that we or the Ukrainians have thrown at them so far should shake them in that confidence. I think they're wrong. I think Russia's going to emerge from this war badly battered and isolated and marginalized on the international stage. But for the moment, they feel that that's absolutely not going to happen.
If the US and NATO countries had made clear many years ago that Ukraine and Georgia would never be invited to join NATO, would Putin have invaded Ukraine?
So the Russian government really wants us to believe that it's our fault that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine and started a war in 2008 against Georgia. I think that is a very convenient alibi for the Russian leadership, and it doesn't really capture the truth and the real motivations for why this war happened. The reason this war happened, as I said earlier, is because Vladimir Putin has tried on 3 separate occasions to force Ukraine back into Russia's orbit, and denies that it's an actual country, that it has any claim on being independent, and he just wants to wipe it off the map. He's never accepted Ukraine after 1991 as an independent country entitled to have relationships with the outside world or go its own way. And what was also clear was that the West wasn't really eager to absorb Ukraine. There was no appetite at NATO to make Ukraine a member of the alliance. There was no appetite at the senior tables of Europe for Ukraine to become a member of the European Union. So this has always been a country that was sort of too big for the West to absorb and too big for Russia to resubordinate it. And in the end, Russia, as I said before, has now gotten the worst of all worlds. It's gotten a Ukraine that's armed to the teeth, that is going to be animated by a sense of intense grievance and vendetta against Russia for all of the crimes that have been committed during this war. And there's no going back to the world that existed on February 23rd before the war existed. The question for the United States, and there's some pivotal choices that are going to have to be made in the coming weeks, is do our leaders now recognize that something's going to change and that our security now hinges on getting a long-term stable arrangement in place to protect Ukraine, and that we need to, basically be willing to give them maybe something short of NATO membership, but something more along the lines of what we've given Israel or Taiwan, which is an interwoven set of defense arrangements, military cooperation, political cooperation that will make them feel secure, but also allow them to have a credible military deterrent to make it really impossible for Russia to forcibly reintegrate Ukraine into its orbit.
Our next audience member asked, after the war, will Russia be forced to pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine?
That's one of those issues that people are still grappling with, and there's a big legal debate. At the beginning of the war, roughly $300 billion in central bank reserves were frozen by the G7 countries. And there's been a debate since that happened in February or March of 2022 about what to do with the money. And it cuts across legal issues that I'm not an expert on, but basically has to do with the question of, can Western assets held anywhere in the world potentially be seized by other governments in a similar kind of one fell swoop? And would we be endangering the sanctity of US assets the world over if we took what has been frozen from the Russian central bank and give it to the Ukrainians to fund their reconstruction? The cost of Ukrainian reconstruction is going to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So I can totally understand why people have latched onto this idea. It has a lot of personal attraction for me. The question is, can you get Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell, people who think about the overall health of the global economy and the growth of the U.S. economy in particular, the health of the U.S. economy in particular, can you get them comfortable with this kind of idea? And that's where I think the real rub is.
So I know that you all mentioned the Wagner Group a little bit earlier in the presentation, but this audience member was wondering, can Putin trust Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, to follow his orders?
Prigozhin is out there every day, and it's become rather embarrassing because he's such a profane figure. He says these really nasty things, talks about stringing up generals, and he's a one-man promotion machine, self-promotion machine, but he's like a notorious trash talker. He has not gone after Putin himself. And he alludes at times to people who are, not serving their commander well, and that those people should be strung up. I haven't heard him go after Putin. There was one comment he made that was ambiguous that suggested that there was a happy grandpa, and it wasn't really clear which happy grandpa he was talking about, whether it was Putin or the defense minister. I think we are looking at a regime that is becoming so degraded and that has hit a moment where it can't perform and meet the demands of the moment. And that creates instability, just by definition. But I don't think we've seen anyone, whether it's Prigozhin or someone else, emerge on the political scene who has attached themselves to the idea of removing Vladimir Putin from power. The people who seek that goal, noble figures like Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition figure who's rotting in prison, those people don't have the authority or the standing to push Putin from power. I would be very skeptical if we'll see someone from the dregs of Russian society like Yevgeny Prigozhin emerge who's able to do that. I think the regime remains very good at self-protection, and it has built an enormous apparatus to keep itself secure.
So we're getting close to the end of the hour. I want to get to two final questions that came in. We've had a number about China. So the first is, it seems obvious that China and Iran are viewing the war and Russia differently than the West. What's their objective? And what role does China play in the war in resolving the situation?
No, I'm glad someone brought this up. So there's no doubt that Russia has become incredibly dependent on China. It's worth remembering that the Sino-Russian relationship has been increasingly cordial since the Gorbachev era. And it was in the late 1980s that Gorbachev first sought to bury the hatchet with the Chinese, and to make the sort of the long path away from confrontation that had begun in the 1950s. The Chinese and Russians see the world in similar ways. They're both very mistrustful of the United States. They think of the US as pushing for regime change in both countries. They don't like the notion of interference in their domestic affairs. They're worried about things like the internet. They're worried about US democracy promotion. So those are things that bring them closer together. But there are these other bigger meta drivers that I think are going to be very hard to separate Russia and China over. One is the fact they have a long land border, and neither country sees any benefit to remilitarizing that land border because they want to focus on other problems. The Russians want to focus on Ukraine and NATO. The Chinese want to focus on Taiwan and the situation in East Asia. And then lastly, there's a natural complementarity of their economies. Russia is a country rich in natural resources. China is a country that's largely deficient in those kinds of things. So it's a natural buyer of Russian raw materials, oil, gas, and other commodities. But it's a buyer's market. And the Chinese drive a really, really hard bargain with the Russians whenever they do anything commercial. In the meantime, Putin is more desperate, and he keeps asking for advanced military assistance from the Chinese. He's made similar requests of the Iranians, and he's gotten partial satisfaction from the Iranians, less so from the Chinese. And the reason is because the Chinese are really self-interested. They have no interest in painting a target on their back and allowing the United States to go after them in the way the US in the past has gone after big companies like Huawei and really damaged their access to key markets around the world. So for now, the Chinese seem basically deterred. What might push them off the sidelines to do something more active in support of the Putin regime? It probably comes back to the scenarios I was talking about with Jim earlier. If there's some massive setback where it looks like the Putin regime is going to go down in flames, you're more likely to see the Chinese be involved. In the case of Iran, I think it's much more opportunistic. And there's a set of things the Iranians want from the Russians, but there's still a lot of mistrust between those two governments. And the Russians are still trying very hard to be friends with everyone in the Middle East. They're friends with Israel, they're friends with the Saudis, they're also friends with the Iranians. They're not really looking to take sides.
Well, great. Thank you so much again to both of you for being here. And Jim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Thanks to you and Katie and other people at the World Affairs Council Town Hall for helping us put this together. And it's been a great conversation. I think it's been at a different kind of level about Russia than we've had, I think, so far in our live streams before. So thanks to you, Andrew, so much for being part of this. Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
Oops. Sorry. Thank you so much, Jim. Andrew, that was just such a sobering, but such a critical discussion. I want to pitch your book one more time, Accidental Czar, The Life and Lives of Vladimir Putin. So we all need to go to the chat. I think Rachel has posted where we can purchase your book. And I can't wait to go through it. I love the graphic format. That's just perfect. So thank you both so much. Jim, as always, Jim is also a member of the board of directors of the World Affairs Council Town Hall. So we appreciate all of the moderating you do with these great programs. Thank you both so much.